I found this old article in my old computer's saved documents. I call it Donald Trump vs. George W. Bush. January 10, 2006. Bush's con jobs, will the U.S. need an IMF bailout? By Paul Craig Roberts. President George W. Bush has destroyed America's economy along with America's reputation as a truthful, compassionate, peace-loving nation that values civil liberties and human rights. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and Harvard University budget expert Linda Bilmes have calculated the cost to Americans of Bush's Iraq war to be between $1 and $2 trillion. This figure is 5 to 10 times higher than the $200 billion that Bush's economic advisor, Larry Lindsey, estimated. Lindsey was fired by Bush, because Lindsey's estimate was 3 times higher than the $70 billion figure that the Bush administration used to mislead Congress and the American voters about the burden of the war. You can't work in the Bush administration unless you are willing to lie for Diobia. Americans need to ask themselves if the White House is in competent hands when a $70 billion war becomes a $2 trillion war. Bush sold his war by understating its cost by a factor of 28.57. Any financial officer anywhere in the world whose project was 2,857% over budget would instantly be fired for utter incompetence. Bush's war cost almost 30 times more than he said it would because the moronic neoconservatives that he stupidly appointed to policy positions told him the invasion would be a cakewalk. Neocons promised minimal U.S. casualties. Iraq already has cost 2,200 dead Americans and 16,000 seriously wounded, and Bush's war is not over yet. The cost of lifetime care and disability payments for the thousands of U.S. troops who have suffered brain and spinal damage was not part of the unrealistic rosy picture that Bush painted. Dr. Stiglitz's $2 trillion estimate is okay as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. My own estimate is a multiple of Stiglitz's. Stiglitz correctly includes the cost of lifetime care of the wounded, the economic value of destroyed and lost lives, and the opportunity cost of the resources diverted to war destruction. What he leaves out is the war's diversion of the nation's attention away from the ongoing erosion of the U.S. economy. War and the accompanying domestic police state have filled the attention span of Americans and their government. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy has been rapidly deteriorating into third world status. In 2005, for the first time on record, consumer, business, and government spending exceeded the total income of the country. Net national savings actually fell. America can consume more than it produces only if foreigners supply the difference. China recently announced that it intends to diversify its foreign exchange holdings away from the US dollar. If this is not merely a threat in order to extort even more concessions from Bush, Americans' ability to consume will be brought up short by a fall in the dollar's value as China ceases to be a sponge that is absorbing an excessive outpouring of dollars. Oil-producing countries might follow China's lead. Now that Americans are dependent on imports for their clothing, manufactured goods, and even high-technology products, a decline in the dollar's value will make all these products much more expensive. American living standards, which have been treading water, will sink. A decline in living standards is an enormous cost and will make existing debt burdens unbearable. Stiglitz did not include this cost in his estimate. Even more serious is the war's diversion of attention from the disappearance of middle-class jobs for university graduates. The ladders of upward mobility are being rapidly dismantled by offshore production for U.S. markets, job outsourcing, and importation of foreign professionals on work visas. In almost every U.S. corporation, U.S. employees are being dismissed and replaced by foreigners who work for lower pay. Even American public school teachers and hospital nurses are being replaced by foreigners imported on work visas. The American dream has become a nightmare for college graduates who cannot find meaningful work. This fact is made abundantly clear from the payroll jobs data over the past 5 years. December's numbers, released on January 6, show the same pattern that I have reported each month for years. Under pressure from offshore outsourcing, the U.S. economy only creates low productivity jobs in low-pay domestic services. Only a paltry number of private sector jobs were created, 94,000. Of these 94,000 jobs, 35,800 or 38% are for waitresses and bartenders. Healthcare and social assistance account for 28% of the new jobs and temporary workers account for 10%. These three categories of low-tech, non-tradable domestic services account for 76% of the new jobs. This is the jobs pattern of a poor third-world economy that consumes more than it produces. America's so-called first-world superpower economy was only able to create in December a measly 12,000 jobs in goods-producing industries, of which 77% are accounted for by wood products and fabricated metal products, the furniture and roofing metal of the housing boom that has now come to an end. U.S. employment declined in machinery, electronic instruments, and motor vehicles and parts. 2,600 jobs were created in computer systems design and related services, depressing news for the several 100,000 unemployed American computer and software engineers. When manufacturing leaves a country, engineering, R&D, and innovation rapidly follow. Now that outsourcing has killed employment opportunities for U.S. citizens and even General Motors and Ford are failing, U.S. economic growth depends on how much longer the rest of the world will absorb our debt and finance our consumption. How much longer will it be before the world's only remaining superpower is universally acknowledged as a debt-ridden, hollowed-out economy desperately in need of IMF bailout? I believe most Americans are unaware of how rapidly they could be driven to personal economic hardship. They got a taste of this when gasoline spiked over $3 a gallon. Several indicators suggest the world is losing confidence in the US dollar, and I worry a massive sell-off will occur if we don't get our financial house in order. There are good supply-demand reasons why oil will reach $80 barrel in the near future that don't even take a sudden, dramatic depreciation of our dollar into consideration. A friend of mine drives a heavy diesel-powered 4WD pickup in conjunction with his work as a dairy equipment technician. He goes from one dairy farm to another installing and fixing equipment. His fuel bill is approaching $400 a week. 2 years ago, he told me, his fuel bill was just another expense, however now it is the overriding consideration. Another friend in that same circle commutes 65 miles one way to work 5 days each week. His specialty doesn't exist locally, and in order to move his wife would have to quit her job. The rapid devaluation of the dollar would have serious consequences for everyone. Drinks are on China. Some years ago, when we were busy moving our manufacturing offshore, it was, oil-producing countries might follow China's lead. The American dream has become a nightmare for college graduates who cannot find meaningful work. Outsourcing has killed employment opportunities for U.S. citizens and even General Motors and Ford. Speaking of China, the Washington Post reports that it's pretty much official, China has resolved to shift some of its foreign exchange reserves, now in excess of $800 billion, away from the US dollar and into other world currencies, in a move likely to push down the value of the greenback, a high-level state economist who advises the nation's economic policy makers said in an interview. As China's manufacturing industries flood the world with cheap goods, the Chinese central bank has invested roughly 3/4 of its growing foreign currency reserves in U.S. Treasury bills and other dollar-denominated assets. The new policy reflects China's fears that too much of its savings is tied up in the dollar, a currency widely expected to drop in value as the U.S. trade and fiscal deficits climb. Of course, some will argue that the falling dollar will improve our trade deficit, as Americans will no longer be able to afford products of foreign origin. These people will go on to say that this improvement will be further enhanced by our goods becoming cheaper abroad, inducing them to purchase more from us. What this argument doesn't take into consideration is this: food, especially winter fruits and vegetables, clothing, and fuel, are necessities, not luxuries. They will all become more expensive. It serves no good interest when the growing number of Americans living in poverty is thus punished. Our goods will become cheaper abroad, but America has abandoned manufacturing to such an extent that goods primarily consist of raw materials. Some years ago, when we were busy moving our manufacturing offshore, it was argued that we would train those former assembly line workers for high technology positions. Sounded good, but the very manufacturing we offloaded inspired a myriad of innovations abroad. Who among us would dispute that Asia has become the world's leader in innovative electronics? Another neocon fantasy laid to rest.